Human beings are social creatures. We love to surround ourselves with other people and share our personal stories and experiences. We crave connection and interaction. Today we only have to turn on our laptops or smartphones to instantly spark up a conversation. So being on your own for long periods of time, isolated from family, friends, and loved ones, can sound a little scary. But what can isolation really do to a person? What effect does disconnecting from the world and society have? And if the time alone is indefinite, how long would it take to drive a person insane? Today we'll attempt to answer these questions by exploring stories of people who have spent hours, months, and even years on their own. In this episode of the Infographics Show, effects of isolation and how long would it take to go crazy. Let's begin by looking at the case of Michel Siffre, a French underground explorer, adventurer, and scientist. On Valentine's Day in 1972, Siffre kissed his wife goodbye and descended 100 feet into the Midnight Cave in Texas. He did not emerge for 6 months. He didn't go crazy, but things did get pretty strange. Siffre lived in a nylon tent surrounded by scientific equipment. He took a few creature comforts, including a freezer, furniture, books, and a music player. NASA supplied all of his food so they could monitor the experiment as part of their research for long-haul space missions. So how did Siffre fare? Well, the lack of sensory and social stimulation led to a gradual deterioration in his mental well-being, and at one point he even thought about suicide. By day 77, his memory was so bad that he forgot things unless he wrote them down immediately. Siffre survived the ordeal. He did not lose his mind, but even 3 years after leaving the cave, he continued to have issues with his memory and eyesight. Years later in 2008, the BBC conducted a similar experiment with a shorter time frame and more extreme conditions. They wanted to try and answer a simple question: can any human endure total sensory deprivation without losing their sanity? A group of 6 volunteers were put into a total isolation chamber, hidden in a former nuclear bunker. No light, no sound, no sensory interaction for 48 hours. One of the volunteers was comedian Adam Bloom. Bloom explained his experience as the hours went by. He started out by talking, singing, and making jokes out loud until he was bored. Next, he stared off into space for some time, and his mind filled with thoughts of his life outside. This led him to worry about his fiancée and family. He fell asleep after a few hours, but when he woke up, he had totally lost track of time. In pitch black and with nothing to reference for the time of day, he found it impossible to regain his body clock. After 18 hours, things took a turn for the worse, and comedian Bloom started experiencing paranoia. He was singing and then crying, his emotions running out of control. At the halfway mark, 24 hours, Bloom's brain power was really flagging. He felt it was impossible to stimulate his mind. At 30 hours, he started pacing his room endlessly to keep himself occupied. Finally, after 40 hours, with only 8 hours to go, Bloom began to hallucinate, seeing a pile of 500 oyster shells. He described seeing the pearly sheen on the shells as clear as day, and he felt like the room was taking off from beneath him. He realized that the lack of stimulation was driving him close to insanity. Bloom survived the final 8 hours and lived to tell the tale. But we can see from this experiment that taking away all of a person's sensory input and locking them away on their own for even a short period of time can begin to drive them crazy. When you think of isolation, something that also springs to mind is life inside a prison. So we decided to look at some of the cases that involve prisoners being kept in solitary confinement. Kenny Zulu Whitmore spent 36 consecutive years in solitary confinement in Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. During his time there, Whitmore was deprived of virtually all human contact and spent 23 hours a day living in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell. After he was eventually released back into the general prison population, Whitmore was suffering from what he described as a constellation of muscle atrophy, cardiovascular hypertension, and deteriorating vision caused by a lack of light and visual stimulation in his stifling cell. 36 years in solitary. Now that's a long time, but it's actually not the record. With a little more digging, we discovered the story of Albert Woodfox. Woodfox was released from jail after a staggering 43 years in isolation. Like Whitmore, Woodfox spent 23 hours of his day living alone in his small cell. In 2014, he relayed his experiences to a blogger. Woodfox described what it was like to be locked in the cell for so many years. He said he feared he might start screaming and not be able to stop. He also felt he might turn into a baby, curl up in a fetal position, and lay there day after day for the rest of his life. Or that he might cut off his balls, throw them through the bars the way he had seen others do when they couldn't take it anymore. Albert Woodfox's comments certainly sound like those of a man who was flirting with insanity, but he survived. His attorney said Woodfox made it through the ordeal because of his extraordinary strength and character. So we've looked at isolation experiments and the effects on the mind, and we've seen how years in a jail cell can push a person to the edge. What other extreme examples of isolation are there? Well, not everyone is forced into isolation. In fact, in some spiritual traditions, practitioners chose to retreat to the forest or into caves for years at a time. One such person is Tenzin Palmo, who at the age of 21 swapped her job as a London librarian for life as a nun in a monastery in India. But even that was not isolated enough for Palmo, and after a few years there, she moved from the monastery and started living in a cave in the Himalayas. The cave measured 10 feet wide and 6 feet deep, and Palmo stayed there for 12 years. 3 of those years she spent meditating, never laying down, sleeping seated in a traditional wooden meditation box for only 3 hours a night. The idea of spending more than a decade in a cave is certainly a crazy one, but this nun re-emerged years later to teach others in the monastery. Did she hold on to her sanity? Was she enlightened? We may never know. So today we've seen there are many examples of people being in isolation for long periods. How long it takes to drive you crazy depends on the individual and the conditions of their isolation. But even in the extreme cases we looked at, when people do lose their grip on reality, they also tend to recover.
Sometimes you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it seems Lady Luck has your back. We might take the case of Dutch cyclist Martin de Jonge, who is said to have cheated death twice after being scheduled to travel on the 2 doomed flights, Malaysia Airlines MH17 and MH370, but he didn't end up getting on either plane. But what about the Croatian man, Franz Selak? It's said he's escaped death no less than 7 times, including being on a train that flipped off the tracks and hurtled into a river. 17 died, but not him. It's said on his first plane trip he was blown out the door, fell to the earth, and landed on a haystack. He was okay, but 19 people died that day. He survived more deadly events and then won over $1 million in the lottery in 2003. But today, we have a special case for you concerning the few human beings that have been on the right side of fortune. He's special because no one that ever existed has been in his shoes. Many people have been lone survivors of catastrophe, but there's no person on record that has survived 2 nuclear bombs. We're of course talking about the 2 bombs the USA dropped on Japan at the end of the Second World War. The first of those 2 bombs was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki 3 days later. Just before we introduce you to the man of the day, we should probably look at just how lucky he was. At the time of the Hiroshima bombing, it's thought that the population of the city was around 340 to 350,000. Many of these people recounted later that they heard an explosion and saw a very bright light. Many others saw the same, but were unable to later recount their experience because they were dead. It's said that of the entire city population, around 70,000 or 80,000 people either died instantly or died soon after due to severe burns. So that's a rather large chunk of the population, and we should say that many more people died later from injury or radiation exposure. You can try and find total deaths in historical resources, but no one seems to agree to the number. Many resources say that just months after the bomb was dropped, the death toll was around 140,000, not much less than half of the city's residents. The U.S. Department of Energy tells us after 5 years, the number could have been as high as 200,000, while some Japanese resources say even higher. While these deaths were from long-term effects, the man in today's show sailed through decades after the bombs were dropped. On top of that, the Japanese later said that around 70% of the city's buildings were totally destroyed, and quite a few more were damaged. Getting out of this almost unscathed was not easy by any means. But as we know, the Allies weren't finished just yet. Over the industrial city of Nagasaki, the population at the time of the bombing was said to be in the region of 260,000. These people were about to get their version of a Big Bang in a very bright light. The star of today's show was about to experience this for the second time in 3 days. Many of the city's factory workers, families, and students were instantly killed. But again, the exact number varies and you can find wide estimates. The number given for immediate deaths after the bomb is usually 40,000 to 75,000. But most agree that by the end of 1945, the number was around 80,000. The U.S. Department of Energy tells us that just after 5 years, you could probably double that number. So that's around 160,000. Let's just say that at the time of the bombing, maybe close to a third of Nagasaki's residents and also non-residents such as POWs died. No doubt the focus of our show today was asking himself if dropping the second bomb was overkill. Many people today say there was really no need to hit a second city, but we won't get into that. Okay, so it's about time we introduce you to our man. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He was born in 1916 and lived until 2010, making him a natural survivor as well as someone who's dodged a rather large bullet a couple of times. Just so you know, while others may have survived both bombs, he is the only person who the Japanese government recognized as doing so. Okay, so Mr. Yamaguchi in his 30s actually lived in Nagasaki, but he made the unfortunate decision, or was told, to go to Hiroshima on a business trip the month of August 1945. At the time, he was working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and it said business wasn't exactly booming as Japan was suffering in its war effort. In fact, Yamaguchi, who never thought Japan would go to war, said later in interviews that he had considered killing his entire family with pills if Japan lost. He also explained what happened on the big day. When the blast occurred in Hiroshima, he said he had just gotten off a tram. What's surprising is that this tram was a mere 2 miles from ground zero. In an interview in 2005, he said this of the moment it all happened. "It was very clear, a really fine day, nothing unusual about it at all. I was in good spirits. As I was walking along, I heard the sound of a plane, just one. I looked up into the sky and saw the B-29, and it dropped 2 parachutes. I was looking up at them, and suddenly it was like a flash of magnesium, a great flash in the sky, and I was blown over." 3 miles away is certainly close enough to be one of those immediate fatalities we talked about. He didn't exactly take it on the chin though, explaining that he was temporarily blinded. He had his eardrums popped and suffered burns to the top half of his body. He later said this, "When the noise and the blast had subsided, I saw a huge mushroom-shaped pillar of fire rising high up into the sky. It was like a tornado." In another interview, he said, "I don't know what had happened. I think I fainted for a while. When I opened my eyes, everything was dark, and I couldn't see much. It was like the start of a film at the cinema, before the picture has begun when the blank frames are just flashing up without any sound." Believe it or not, he told the press years later he decided the best thing to do was to go back home to Nagasaki and report for work. Covered in bandages, he made his way the next day to the train station, looking at the devastation around him, risking radiation poisoning, he didn't know that, to find a way back to his presumably safe city. He said he encountered dead bodies strewn around. It was mayhem. Bodies floated in the river like blocks of wood, he said. He had to cross that river since the bridge was destroyed, saying he trod on the bodies of women and children and men, what he has called his human raft. Walking through the streets, he described what he saw. People, bodies, their skin had peeled, their flesh was wet and mushy, and they had no faces. Their eyes, noses, and mouths had been burned away, and it looked like their ears had melted off. He managed to get back to Nagasaki and was relieved to find his wife and 6-month-old son alive and well. News didn't travel too fast back in those days, and Yamaguchi told his bosses of the devastation a bomb had caused in Hiroshima. He said they didn't believe him, that just one bomb could flatten a whole city, and they questioned his sanity. They would soon know exactly what he was talking about, because their city was next. This is what he said in a translated interview with the American media many years later. "I was telling my company's supervisor in Nagasaki that one bomb had destroyed all of Hiroshima. He told me I was crazy." Just as he said that, the bomb fell on Nagasaki. He also said just before that happened, his boss had said to him, "You're an engineer, calculated. How could one bomb destroy a whole city?" Boom. That's how might have been the answer. On the day of the bombing, yet again Yamaguchi was about 3 miles from ground zero. Again, he was knocked to the ground, but he managed to get to his feet and had no idea what was going on. You must remember that the world had no idea something so powerful existed. It wasn't as if Yamaguchi had watched infomercials that people in the West saw years later, talking about the deadly destruction of an atomic bomb. Yamaguchi later said in an interview, "I thought the mushroom cloud had followed me from Hiroshima. This time his family weren't so safe, and while they weren't as close to ground zero as the patriarch, they felt the bomb." In a strange twist of fate, his wife that day had been out looking to buy ointment that could help with her husband's burns. Her house was much closer to ground zero than the place she was at the time of the explosion. Yamaguchi later said that the fact that he'd been hit by the first bomb might have saved his wife from the second bomb. Even so, Yamaguchi's daughter said years later in an interview that her mother had told her she was soaked in black rain and was poisoned. She lived until 88 but did die of liver and kidney cancer. Her brother would also succumb to cancer in his 50s, and her older sister said she had been chronically ill her entire life. She even said that she believes her mother passed the poison she had been engulfed with to them. During life after the bombings, Yamaguchi was quiet and very rarely spoke about his experience. But later he said he felt compelled to talk about the horror of nuclear war. "My double radiation exposure is now an official government record. It can tell the younger generation the horrifying history of the atomic bombings even after I die," he said. In a separate interview, he also said, "Having been granted this miracle, it is my responsibility to pass on the truth to the people of the world." One day, Yamaguchi said, he hoped there would be no bombs that destructive in the world, that countries would agree not to chase such technology that could almost destroy every person on the planet and undo civilization as we know it. In one of his final interviews, he said, "Japan can't rid the world of nuclear weapons by itself. The whole world needs to hold hands and prevent this type of war." Mr. Obama is now the US president, and I listened to his speech. Maybe there is hope. He died in January 2010 from stomach cancer.
Before we start talking about possibly the world's unluckiest man, let's first ask why people get hit by lightning. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tells us that lightning will hit the tallest object with a positive charge from the negatively charged cloud where it begins. So, maybe the worst thing you could do would be to stand in a swimming pool during a thunderstorm holding a very tall metal rod. Lightning often hits trees, but in a wide open space, such as a golf course, it could be you. That happened not long ago to a British woman on holiday in Turkey. She got hit and died 12 days later from cardiac arrest. People often do survive lightning strikes though, such as the guy we'll be talking about today in this episode of the Infographics Show, What Happened to the Man Who Got Hit by Lightning 7 Times. Let's first ask what chance is there of being hit by lightning and what will likely happen to you if you do get hit. There is data available regarding exactly how many lightning deaths there are year by year in each country. According to the National Lightning Safety Institute, if you are Mexican, beware. That data tells us that Mexico is way out in front of lightning deaths with 223 last time they did the count. Thailand was second at 171 deaths, South Africa third with 150 deaths, and Brazil fourth with 132 deaths. Then there's a big drop off to Romania in 5th place at 75 deaths. The US is quite high in 9th place with 50 deaths. Perhaps data wasn't available in many countries, but according to that report, most of the world sees no lightning strike deaths each year, but in most countries, people will be hit. If you come from the US, you have a 1 in 171,000 chance of being hit, which might be long odds, but not that long. That is just 1 year though. If you live until you are 80 and you are American, your chance of being hit is around 1 in 14,600, according to the National Weather Service. By comparison, CNBC said that the odds for winning the Powerball Grand Prize is about 1 in 292.2 million. 1 in 171,000 for this year might not quite give you peace of mind, and if you are Mexican or Thai, we suggest you stay off the golf course on a stormy day. But what is the chance of instant death if you do get hit? Well, 90% of folks that are unfortunate enough to be the recipient of a lightning strike actually survive. All is not lost, except perhaps a bit of hair and some brain function. Yes, that's the worst part. Lightning can carry up to 1 billion volts of electricity, and if that smacks you when traveling at an average speed of 200,000 miles per hour, it's bound to have a profound effect under the hood, so to speak. Experts tell us that the good news is people are very, very rarely hit by a direct strike. You might also pick up the phone and get a blast to the head as the lightning travels to you, and this is called a contact strike, but one of those is not surprisingly super rare too. Most of the time, when people are hit by lightning, what we actually mean is that the lightning hit something and then the current traveled to you. For instance, if the lightning hit the ground anywhere as far as 60 feet away, you could literally get the shock of your life. It might hit the ground, travel to you, go up one leg and down the other, all the while stopping your heart and lungs from functioning. The more power that goes through you, the more likely you are to die or suffer some serious damage. You might even get what's called a side splash, which means the lightning jumps from an object and onto you. That object could even be your friend, which was a particularly distressing fact for the star of today's show. Let's say you do survive. What are the odds of coming out of it smiling? Well, it's likely that the strike will change you. The nerve damage could have an effect on your memory, your personality, or it might give you regular headaches or even epilepsy. One guy who got hit told American media, "I know for a fact that people think I'm really weird." He was a changed man. If that isn't bad enough, the strike itself can severely burn you. With all this in mind, how on earth did someone survive 7 strikes? His name was Roy Sullivan. and he died in 1983 at the ripe old age of 71. The former U.S. park ranger has a place in the Guinness Book of Records for most hits by lightning. His nickname was the Human Lightning Conductor. When you hear that, it's kind of funny. It's even more amusing that many of his friends stopped hanging out with him outside because of their perceived risk of being hit while near him. The least funny part of the tale is that when he was lying in bed next to his fourth wife, he shot himself in the head. That was the end of old Roy, and his 41-year-old wife had to deal with the mess. It seems nature couldn't get this guy, and he got himself in the end. Roy was first hit in 1942 and suffered burns but no brain damage. You see, his job meant working in the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, and as we know, such places can be dangerous places to be during thunderstorms. It wouldn't be until 1969 that he was hit for a second time, and that time he was driving in his truck. The lightning hit the truck and knocked poor Roy unconscious, but all he suffered were injuries to his vanity. The strike took his hair, eyebrows, and eyelashes. He was hit again a year later, and he just brushed that one off. In 72, he was hit again, and again went the hair. As you can well imagine, by this point, Roy was getting rather paranoid. Let's hope he wasn't taking any of that LSD that was everywhere in those days. He started to think that some kind of powerful force was out to get him, and so he stayed away from crowds just in case he provoked the wrath of this mighty lightning god again and others got hurt. On a more practical level, he started carrying around a can of water, likely a bit ruffled by the fact that he'd been made bald against his will on 2 occasions. The hippie era had not been very loving for this man, and things were about to get even worse. In 1973, Pink Floyd released The Dark Side of the Moon, which is perhaps where Roy thought he belonged. He was hit by lightning again that year, and this time said that the cloud had definitely been following him. He had tried to get away, but to no avail. He had driven from the cloud and then run from his truck, and boom, it got him. This time he was able to put his burning hair out. He said about the strike, "When my ears stopped ringing, I heard something sizzling. It was my hair on fire. The flames were up 6 inches." Roy then had a good run of 3 whole years of not being hit, although he still kept away from clouds. But on June 5th, 1976, there was a particularly fast cloud he apparently couldn't escape from, and it got him. "I actually saw the lightning shoot out of the cloud this time, and it was coming straight for me," he later said. This time, he had no can of water at hand, and again he lost most of his hair. He was hit for the last time almost exactly a year later while he was fishing. Yep, there goes the hair again, but he also suffered more severe burns this time and the loss of hearing in one ear. On his way back to the car, as if things weren't bad enough, he was confronted by a bear. That was his final hit, although his wife also got one when she was with him. She'd been hanging out the washing with Roy nearby, but this time, the lightning god chose the spouse. Now, all of this sounds kind of sketchy. Was Roy looking for attention? Did he have a habit of self-harm by setting fire to his hair? He was always alone when hit, so we may wonder if he really had been doing too many drugs or was just a bit crazy. But all his hits were confirmed by the superintendent of Shenandoah National Park, R. Taylor Hoskins. What's more surprising than merely surviving is the fact that he didn't seem to suffer any long-term mental injuries. At the same time, the fact he blew his brains out could mean he wasn't exactly in the best frame of mind. Now, you might be thinking, what are the odds of being hit 7 times? Well, it works out at 4.15 in 1 bazillion. That's a 1 with 32 zeros after it. Maybe Roy should have played the lottery.
October 4th, 2003. He thought he was being pranked. Emergency Service Unit cop Martin Duffy thought the old-timer was hazing him when he reported to work and was told his mission for the afternoon. But it was no joke. Soon Officer Duffy found himself climbing out of a window on the 7th floor and rappelling down the side of a 21-story Harlem apartment building. At the 5th floor, he dangled, peering into an apartment window, then took aim and fired a tranquilizer dart gun. The dart hit the 400-pound tiger in the rump. Enraged, the massive cat roared, showing off long, wicked-looking canines, and then charged toward the window. From the time he was little, Antoine Yates adored animals. He was always bringing home stray puppies or injured birds. His mother Martha indulged his love, allowing her son to keep a variety of pets throughout his childhood. As Antoine got older, his interests turned to more exotic animals. The peace he found in taking care of animals was a refuge against the dangerous, crime-infested Harlem neighborhood where he grew up in the early 1980s. While his brother Aaron took to the streets, Antoine was inside with his pets. Over time, he had boa constrictors and several other reptiles, capuchin and squirrel monkeys. In the spring of 2000, the Yates family, which included a rotating group of foster kids, was living in a 5-bedroom apartment in the Drew Hamilton houses, a huge dismal housing project built in the 1960s. Antoine, now in his early 30s, concocted a plan with his mother and sister to open a zoo. He already owned 2 pythons and a caiman. Despite only being a part-time taxi driver, Antoine was able to save up thousands of dollars and falsify papers to prove he had a zoo in order to purchase a lion club from the Bearcat Hollow Animal Park in Racine, Minnesota. Later, Antoine also purchased Ming, an 8-week-old Siberian Bengal hybrid tiger cub from the same breeders. In addition to his other pets, eventually Antoine ended up with 2 lions and 2 tiger cubs. Not long after, his mom and sister backed out of the zoo project and Antoine was forced to give up his new pets. Antoine rehomed the pythons, lion cubs, and one of the tigers, but kept Al the caiman and Ming the tiger cub, whom he especially loved. Over the next 3 years, Antoine raised Ming in the Yate family's 5th-floor apartment. He fed him bottles around the clock. Ming quickly graduated to pureed meat and then meat chunks. Martha gradually became unhappy with the living situation. Fearing for her and her children's safety, she and 2 foster children moved to Philadelphia, relinquishing apartment E5 to her son. Antoine built Ming a sandpit complete with balls. Al the caiman, who lived in another bedroom, had a custom fiberglass tank. Sometimes Antoine would freeze a pan of liver and give Ming a giant meat popsicle. By the time Ming was 3 in 2003, he'd weighed over 400 pounds. Antoine was feeding him about 20 pounds of raw chicken a day. The tiger was a semi-open secret. Some of Antoine's friends and neighbors were aware of the big cat. Across the way, there was a senior citizen center as part of the apartment complex. Ming used to stand on his hind legs and look out the window. Aaron joked with his brother about the workers at the retirement home thinking that the old people were senile when they claimed to have seen a tiger looking out of an apartment window. On and off, Antoine had roommates who were at first scared but became accustomed to the tiger. Antoine went through bouts of depression where he was a recluse. He would mainly meditate and hang out with Ming. One day, Antoine found a small black kitten. As always, he took the stray home, naming it Shadow. He kept Shadow in a bedroom away from the tiger. Unfortunately, Shadow got out. Territorial Ming went for the kitten. Antoine tried to intervene and protect it. Aaron had a premonition that something was wrong and rushed over to the apartment to find his brother Antoine in shock. Ming had severely bitten Antoine's arm and leg. Aaron called 911, but there was no way they wanted the paramedics coming to the apartment and discovering Ming. Aaron helped his brother down to the lobby where they were met by police. Antoine was transported to the Harlem Hospital Center, where he claimed that he'd been attacked by a bulldog. However, the doctors were suspicious. The bites looked like they came from an animal with a much larger jaw. Meanwhile, the police received 2 anonymous tips in the next few days following the attack. One said there was a wild animal somewhere in the city. The second call directed them to the exact address. That evening, a policeman came knocking on the door of apartment E5 for a welfare check. No one was home, but the officer heard loud growling noises coming from the apartment. Wisely, he decided to not go in. The officer talked to a neighbor who complained of large amounts of urine and a strong smell coming through the ceiling. Officers from TARU, the Technical Assistance Response Unit, drilled a hole through the neighbor's wall to get a visual of what was inside the apartment. They saw a mattress that had been shredded as if it were made of paper. Claw marks scratched down the wall from ceiling to floor, and then Ming wandered into view. 400 pounds of rippling muscled cat, over 9 feet tall when he stood on his hind legs. The massive tiger was even shocking to jaded police who thought they had seen it all. The tiger was left alone for the night. The apartment cordoned off while the police formulated a plan. They didn't want to have to kill the tiger, yet they had to safely remove the big cat from the apartment while keeping the public protected. They called animal experts, including Dr. Robert A. Cook, the head veterinarian at the Bronx Zoo, for help. The next day, from the apartment below on the 4th floor, the police raised a pole-mounted camera out of the window to keep track of Ming. Meanwhile, on the 7th floor, the police laid out a strategy. Dr. Cook prepared tranquilizer darts for the chosen marksman, Officer Duffy, and gave him advice. Around 4:30 p.m., police sniper Duffy, armed both with a tranquilizer dart gun and a rifle with live ammunition, abseiled down to the 5th floor. Meanwhile, the word had gotten out about the tiger. The media, along with a curious crowd of citizens, gathered below to watch. Dangling in a rope sling, Officer Duffy peered into the bedroom window of apartment E5. He could clearly see Ming peacefully chilling on the bedroom floor. The tiger looked back at the policeman and then turned slightly, giving Duffy a good view of his hindquarters. Duffy held the tranquilizer gun up to the window, making sure that the barrel wasn't blocked by the child's safety slates. Scarcely breathing, he pulled the trigger. The dart landed true, hitting Ming in the butt. The tiger jumped up and went berserk. He roared and charged the window. The building shook as the massive cat smashed into the window, cracking it. As the tiger headbutted the window again, Duffy worried that the glass would give way. If the big cat survived the fall, they'd have an angry, injured tiger on a crowded public street. Duffy took aim and shot again. The second dart shot caused Ming to retreat. He laid down in a nest of plastic trash bags. About 12 minutes later, the tiger tried to get up but staggered, feeling the effects of the sedation. After waiting another 5 minutes guarded by a group of emergency service unit officers, Dr. Cook and another zoo staffer cautiously entered the apartment. Ming lay in a corner. The zoo staff slipped a restraint pole around Ming's head and gave him a little more sedative by injection to make sure he was sedated enough to transport. Ming was then lifted onto a gurney. A fire department oxygen mask was clamped to his face. The gurney was carefully wheeled down the hall and onto the elevator. Once they were on the street, officers had to force the crowd back as a half-dozen men struggled to hoist Ming into the back of an animal care and control box truck. The police also removed Al the caiman, who was nearly 5 feet long, a rabbit, and several other exotic and domestic pets from the apartment. Allegedly, Antoine had a second tiger, some bear cubs, 2 Rottweilers, more rabbits, and a tarantula. Ming was taken to the Center for Animal Care and Control on 110th Street and given a checkup. Despite the fact that he was raised in a tiny New York apartment, the tiger was relatively healthy. Meanwhile, Antoine mysteriously checked out of the hospital. Authorities finally located him in Philadelphia, where he was being treated at the University of Pennsylvania Medical Center. Antoine was arrested on charges of reckless endangerment and the possession of a wild animal. Eventually, he was able to get some pro bono help to fight the case. He also had some support from people in the community. During his court proceedings, a small crowd gathered outside of the courthouse to chant, "Free Tiger Man!" Antoine's lawyers presented him as maybe a little misguided, but someone who deeply loved animals. Later, Martha Yates was charged with endangering the welfare of a child, since she kept foster children in the apartment. As part of a plea agreement to reduce charges against his mother, Antoine pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to a 5-month prison term with 5 years probation. Antoine was released after serving only 3 months. He sued New York City for the loss of his pets and for $7,000 cash, which he claimed had also been in the apartment when the police raided it. A judge quickly dismissed the case, calling Antoine full of chutzpah. Since losing Ming and spending time in jail, Antoine's life had been a bit of a mystery. For a while, Antoine tried to get a job with several different exotic professional animal handlers, but no one wanted to work with him. He was notorious, and the idea of keeping a magnificent animal in a tiny apartment left a bad taste in some people's mouths. In the intervening years, Antoine's been interviewed at various times by the media. A few documentaries have been made about the tiger raised in Harlem. In October 2010, the Animal Planet channel featured the story of Antoine Yates and Ming on the show Fatal Attractions. For some time, Antoine's claimed to be on the verge of various deals to open a zoo and get Ming back. He's also made many unverifiable claims about different jobs he's had working with exotic cats. Ming is now 19 and has lived at the Noah's Lost Ark Animal Sanctuary in Berlin Center, Ohio, after being moved there from the Center for Animal Care and Control in 2003. Al was also rehomed to an animal sanctuary. The tale of Antoine Yates and Ming, admittedly, is the most extreme case of owning an exotic animal. Though the number is slowly growing due to recent conservation programs, researchers estimate that there are only about 4,000 tigers left in the wild worldwide. There are a couple thousand tigers in the US, with upwards of 500 big cats privately owned as pets.
Following on from our strangest serial killer in the US, we now bring you one of the weirdest tales from the dark side of humanity. Okay, so our woman of the hour may not have been as maniacal as lady killer Ted Bundy, or as utterly demented as Ed Gein, the man who liked to dress in skin suits made from dead women, but she has certainly worked her way into the serial killer hall of infamy just for originality. It's conceivable the novel and then movie Fight Club may have used her wicked deeds as inspiration regarding soap made out of liposuction waste, so we can't say she made her mark on history. Welcome to this episode of the Infographics Show, Leonarda Cianciulli, aka the Human Flesh Soap Maker. Okay, so there isn't really a big reveal to this show, as the title pretty much explains what this serial killer got up to. But who was she before she started making lumps of soap out of the people she killed? Let's start with a short bio. Leonarda Cianciulli, aka the Human Soap Maker, aka the Soap Maker of Correggio, in Italian it sounds much more poetic, La saponificatrice di Correggio was born in 1894 and lived until an old age, dying in 1970. Her childhood wasn't easy, and reading about it, you might not be surprised that she turned out, a little odd. Apparently her mother was a nasty woman, telling Leonarda that she was cursed by the devil and that her life would come to nothing. That's not easy on a child, and when she was a teenager, she tried to commit suicide not once, but twice. She was yet another serial killer with what is known as an overbearing mother. She then met a fellow when she got older, a registry office clerk, but he wasn't quite what her mother was expecting, and so the man was vociferously disapproved of. She had in total 17 kids, which is quite the accomplishment, but unfortunately only 4 of them lived past the age of 10. You could say after all that heartache and pain, she was a protective mother to those that survived. Leonarda doted on her kids, but she was full of anger at what life had thrown at her. And it threw a lot more than dying children and miscarriages. Perhaps it was very much her fault when she got imprisoned for fraud at the age of 33, but when an earthquake destroyed her house a few years later, that seemed like rotten luck again. Nonetheless, this unlucky woman was apparently well liked in her community, if not in her own mind, doomed somewhat. In fact, it said she even believed that her mother was right, and indeed she was cursed. She went to see a gypsy fortune teller, but that just made matters a lot worse, as it said this is what she was told. In your right hand, I see prison, in your left, a criminal asylum. Okay, so you kinda get the picture. This is a woman who had a brutal life, but on the surface of things, she looked okay. Her neighbors liked her, and she was a loving mother to the dear children that didn't kick the bucket before they got out of primary school. But something sinister was lurking behind the scenes. Imagine this. One day your neighbor, a loving mother and good friend, the owner of a shop in town, a trusted member of the community, invites you for cake and coffee. You accept the offer and are greeted with some sweet-tasting cakes. Only you don't know that the cakes are part human. Yes, between 1939 and 1940, when she was about 42 or 43, Leonarda murdered 3 women. The story goes that she wasn't just killing because she was inherently evil, but she believed, again, that she was cursed and that to keep her remaining kids alive, she had to make some sacrifices, as you do. She was particularly concerned about her favorite son Giuseppe, who had just signed up to the Italian army and was about to join the battlefields of bloody Europe. So, that's what she did. She made some sacrifices like those old school Aztecs who propitiated the gods with human blood. Leonarda lured these women into her shop and then drugged them. After they passed out, she killed them with an axe and then boiled their bodies in caustic soda. So far so good, but that doesn't mean everything just disappears. In her own diaries, Leonarda described what was left as a thick, dark mush. So, our killer went a step further. You might know that regular soap often contains animal fats. So, Miss Cinciulli realized she could turn human fat into soap. She actually explained this in her diaries. Her flesh was fat and white. When it had melted, I added a bottle of cologne, and after a long time on the boil, I was able to make some most acceptable creamy soap. I gave bars to neighbors and acquaintances. What a sweet gift that was, and Leonarda went as far as to call the remains of her victims very sweet. She didn't stop there though. Waste not, want not was likely her motto. She used part of this mush to make what she called crunchy cakes. This wasn't, it seems, out of rage towards her neighbors, because she said she and her sons all ate the delicious cakes. She said of her process, "As for the blood in the basin, I waited until it had coagulated, dried it in the oven, ground it, and mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, milk, and eggs, as well as a bit of margarine, kneading all the ingredients together. Voila! Human cake." You could at least call her resourceful, which isn't necessarily a bad thing during a world war. But she wasn't exactly a clever killer and was easily found out. You see, she didn't just make things from her victims, but she scammed them out of money too. She went as far as to tell these women that she had found a great teaching job for them abroad, and just before they set off, Leonarda coerced them to write to their family and friends, explaining that they would be leaving the country for a while to work. There was no job, of course, and a fate worse than cake awaited them. One such victim, Virginia Cacioppo, had disappeared, and her sister had said the last person who had seen her was that shopkeeper called Leonarda. She didn't buy into the teaching job and believed a cunning canard had taken place. She was right. Later, Leonarda would remark that this was her best victim in terms of how she turned out on the plate and in the bathroom. In her diaries she wrote, "The cakes, too, were better. That woman was really sweet." At first the Italian cops accused Leonarda, who denied any wrongdoing. But then the cops accused her son, good old Giuseppe, and that was too much to bear for the doting mother. She confessed to everything, even the soap and cake bit. Not surprisingly, this soon became a cause célèbre in Italy. The trial lasted 3 days, and after that, our loving mother would spend a total of 30 years in prison and 3 years in an asylum. She died at age 76 from a cerebral apoplexy. She still causes shivers down people's spines today, as you can see her axe and other instruments, including the pot in which she boiled the bodies, at the Criminology Museum in Rome, Italy.
The world is a strange and wonderful place, and unfortunately for some, the world of medical disorders is just as strange and a whole lot less wonderful. Most of us take our health for granted, and yet there are millions living amongst us with medical conditions that are not just debilitating but truly bizarre. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're going to tell you about some of the most bizarre medical conditions in the world. Non-stop hiccups. Hiccups are a pretty benign reaction triggered by an irritation of the diaphragm caused by the stomach, and typically occurs only after we eat or drink too much too quickly. Yet in 2009, Christopher Sands had been battling hiccuping for over 2 years, stating that the hiccuping started out of the blue and for no apparent reason. Sands at first did what most of us would do, a whole slew of random remedies gleaned from family, friends, and the internet. Yet despite special drinking cups, hypnotherapy, yoga, and even herbal remedies from the Far East, the hiccups wouldn't stop. Doctors investigating Sands' condition looked for a source of irritation on his diaphragm, or possibly a perforation, and yet test after test discovered nothing wrong with him. The only possible culprit was a damaged valve that connected his stomach to his esophagus. But this was a condition he had been born with, and other than frequent heartburn and vomiting, had not caused any hiccuping previously in his life. The hiccuping can strike completely out of nowhere and plagued Sands for hours, making sleep, eating, or performing on stage with his band impossible. According to Sands, he could hiccup for 14 hours non-stop, or go through periods where he was completely free of them, although he always felt that he was about to hiccup at any moment, similar to the way you might feel when a sneeze is on its way. Sands traveled across Britain for almost 3 years before a Japanese company making a TV show about him flew him to Tokyo, where an MRI scan diagnosed him with a small 1.2 centimeter growth on his brainstem. Despite being warned that the tumor was inoperable by the Japanese doctors who discovered it, Sands immediately flew home for a complex brain surgery. The surgery was a success, yet left Sands with difficulty coordinating his movements and some numbness on his left side. Still, for the man who had hiccuped non-stop for years, it was well worth it. We suppose it was truly lucky that Sands was British and had the rapid and life-changing surgery without also going bankrupt from medical bills. Now you see me, now you see nothing for 3 days. Some nights, Natalie Adler of Melbourne, Australia will feel her eyes getting quite heavy, and not with sleep. Yet when she eventually does go to sleep, she wakes up unable to open her eyes. The strange affliction generally lasts about 3 days, after which she's once more able to open her eyes normally and see just fine. Flown to doctors both in Australia and the US, where she must have incredible insurance, neither nation's physicians have been able to diagnose a cause for her condition. Per Dr. Dean Sestari, a neuro-ophthalmologist at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary in Boston, there's nothing that would cause symptoms of a woman to close her eyes for 3 days and open her eyes for 3 days. Sestari believes, however, that the physical condition may be the manifestation of a psychological one, with her mind converting some internal conflict into a physical ailment. Now aged 30, Adler has had 99% of the muscles in her eyelids removed to keep them from closing shut, and yet her eyes will still squeeze shut at least once a month. She relies on constant Botox injections to help keep her eyes open, yet says that the treatments are losing their effectiveness. Constantly turned on. Persistent sexual arousal may seem like a funny joke to some, but for the women who live with PSAS, it's a daily nightmare. Not formally recognized until 2001, PSAS sees women living constantly on the brink of an orgasm, and yet the symptoms are only partially relieved through an actual orgasm. Sex itself can often not help quell it either, and in fact might make it worse. Research into the causes are still rudimentary and has left doctors baffled, with no obvious underlying physical or psychological cause. Yet when the topic is brought up, many snicker and laugh at its mention, which leads doctors to believe that thousands of women may suffer from the condition yet never seek treatment out of embarrassment. For those afflicted, despite the jokes, they see the condition as a curse, and one woman who suffered it her entire life says that she would rather never experience an orgasm again than to continue to live like this forever. The real Iceman. Wim Hof has a pretty strong resistance to the cold, yet for a native Dutchman that's no great boast. The Netherlands sees some pretty cold winters after all. What makes Wim Hof unique though is just how resistant he is to cold, which borders on supernatural powers. In one stunt, he immersed himself completely in ice water, with just a pair of shorts for modesty, and stayed there for an hour and 12 minutes, at temperatures similar to those that killed the passengers of the Titanic in minutes. Then in January 1999, he went 100 miles north of the Arctic Circle to run half a marathon in his bare feet. In 2002, and dressed up only in a swimsuit, he dove under the ice at the North Pole and earned a Guinness World Record for longest distance swimming under the ice, 80 meters. He has even scaled Mount Everest in just his shorts. Hof explains that he discovered his supernatural abilities over 30 years ago, when while strolling through a park as a teenager, he saw the ice-covered water and thought to himself, what would happen if I go in there? For most people, the answer would be instant hypothermia followed by possible death. And yet, feeling an insatiable desire to strip naked and dive in, Hof hopped into the frozen water and said he felt amazing when he got back out. He immediately turned the stunt into a routine, and years later had discovered superhuman abilities to withstand freezing temperatures. With most people unable to survive such exposure to extremely low temperatures without at least losing a few toes to frostbite, Hof has explained that he believes his powers come from nothing more than a specialized set of breathing techniques. Marketing the techniques around the world, Hof has drawn some consternation from the relatives of at least 2 people who died after trying to follow his exercise program by replicating his cold water immersions. Allergic to cold. Wim Hof may have a superhuman ability to withstand the cold, but unfortunately for some, their superhuman power lies in being super susceptible to the cold, to the point of being physically allergic to it. And no, we don't mean the excuse you make up when you're tucked in under a warm blanket and your alarm rings to get ready to go to work. These people suffer physical ailments from exposure to the cold, no different than what many would display as allergic reactions to materials, food, and insect bites. Known as cold urticaria, these individuals can develop huge welts if, for instance, you place an ice cube on their skin, and exposure to winter winds and cold can prompt these debilitating symptoms. Having a few snowflakes land on their face may elicit a response in the form of itchy and uncomfortable bumps, while diving into a cold swimming pool could induce a potentially lethal allergic shock. Dr. Gerald Gleich at the University of Utah says that some of his patients have experienced full-blown vascular collapse and ended up at death's door just from the act of going outside in the winter. He goes on to explain that the reaction to the cold is brought about by an inappropriate immune system response. In this case, an antibody known as immunoglobulin E is the prime suspect. While no cure exists, the good news is that the same allergy relief you may seek out for springtime's heavy pollen blooms is also effective for sufferers of cold urticaria, and antihistamines provide relief for those afflicted. But I'm not tired. It's natural for most 4-year-olds to resist bedtime, yet in 2009 for Rhett Lamb of the UK, going to sleep was impossible. Per his mother, the boy would stay awake for nearly 24 hours a day, and his sleeplessness manifested at birth. Concerned that her baby wasn't sleeping, his mother went on frequent visits to the hospital. But the doctors assumed she was just being a nervous mother. Only after a year of little to no sleep did medical experts begin to take the condition seriously. But it would take a further 3 years for a diagnosis to be discovered. Rhett was diagnosed with a very rare condition called Chiari malformation, in which the brain is squeezed into the spinal column. This causes compression and strangulation of the brainstem, which is where vital functions that control sleep and speech are located, along with areas responsible for regulating our circulatory system and even our breathing. The boy, who had been sleepless for years, had grown extremely irritable and unsocial. Underwent immediate and very risky surgery, with the doctors removing a portion of the bone around his brainstem and spinal cord. Initially, they expected 50-50 odds on seeing any improvement, but a year later, Rhett was once more able to sleep, and his behavior has dramatically changed as a result. If you think you're cranky when you can't get a nap in, try and see how cranky you'll be after 4 years of no sleep. You're not from around here, or are you? Everyone knows that severe brain trauma can have long-lasting and serious effects, everything from landing yourself in a coma to losing partial or full control over your body's functions. Yet for some people, severe brain trauma can have an altogether very peculiar effect: the development of a completely foreign accent. Canadian Rosemarie Dorr suffered a stroke on the left side of her brain in 2006, and very quickly after developed a strong Eastern Canadian accent, despite living in West Canada and having never visited the region or even knowing anyone from there. Visited by a nurse from Newfoundland while recovering from her stroke, Dora recounts that the nurse came into her room and asked, "Who's the Newfie here?" in reference to Newfoundland. Dora replied that there was nobody there from that region, to which the nurse said, "I think I'm talking to her." That's when it dawned on Dora that her speech had radically changed. Extremely rare, foreign accent syndrome has only 60 verified cases in medical history, with one of the first known sufferers being a Norwegian woman who during World War II was hit in the head by a bomb fragment. After recovering, the woman began to speak with a strong German accent, which led to her being targeted by those with strong anti-German sentiments. Yet the condition remains to this day, with a Florida woman developing a British accent, a Japanese woman developing a Korean accent, and a man from rural South Carolina developing a strong French accent. Doctors remain perplexed as to the cause, but are convinced that it's the result of neurological damage suffered after trauma, such as that experienced during a stroke. While it may not be truly debilitating for its sufferers, it is certainly strange, and no treatment has yet been developed. The world really is a strange place, and life can be difficult enough without developing one of these abnormal and extremely rare disorders. While medical science constantly makes new breakthroughs, it seems that the complex machinery of the human body still confounds scientists, and at times baffles our explanations of what should be physically possible or impossible for the human body to do. Hopefully, in time, science will learn to treat some of these most serious medical ailments, and maybe even give us some of the rare benefits, such as being able to withstand extreme cold, or perhaps switch our speaking accents at will. Memories have brought us to where we are and allow us to anticipate where we'll go next. But what if we had none and further couldn't make any? What if we were drifting in decades of darkness with no idea what happened last or what was soon to come? Memories are what anchor us in time and to the people around us. Without them, we become lonely, lost, and confused. For Clive Waring, amnesia is living death. Learn about his burden with the worst case of amnesia ever in this episode of the Infographics Show, The Man with the 30-Second Memory. To understand the life of Clive Waring, we must first understand memory. It begins with what we experience. While we interact with the world around us, the neurons or nerve cells of our brains are busy firing away to make sense of what we touch, taste, hear, feel, and see. And it turns out these cells play a crucial role in our ability to remember these later on. When electrodes were placed on the brains of study subjects as they watched part of a show, for instance, firing from one neuron to another could be seen in the hippocampus and the cortex of their brains. When the subjects later recalled the show, it reactivated the neurons that had fired as they watched it the first time. It's believed we must recall past events to strengthen neural pathways, or they will not transfer well to long-term memory. On the other hand, if we do revisit an event, it will become both vivid and rich in detail, as well as easy to recollect. The same is true for the brain in general, as it's made up of muscle. If it's used often, it grows strong. In absence of exercise, it grows weak. Of course, over time, like the other muscles in our body, its function will decline as part of the natural course of life. However, while slowed activity or lapses in memory can be normal with age, a drastic loss of days to years of our past is not. Neither is the inability to remember anything new. Sometimes this happens when things go wrong in the brain, particularly with the hippocampus or cortex. The hippocampus sits in the temporal lobe, deep within the center of the brain, and helps with the formation of memory. In addition to this, the hippocampus is where the conversion from short-term to long-term memory takes place. However, it's in the cortex where the long-term memories are stored. As a result, damage to the hippocampus may prevent new memories from being made, while damage to the cortex impacts memories made before. The damage to these structures or the areas immediately around them may result in a condition called amnesia. All kinds of amnesia are characterized by some type of memory loss. Some may be unable to recall past memories, others may fail to make new memories, and many have a limited to non-existent concept of the future. Things that are forgotten include details of what they have done, things that have taken place, people they knew or loved, and facts they learned or were taught. Often, despite this, most retain a basic understanding of who they are and can still perform procedural functions, such as riding a bicycle. Language ability is often intact as well. However, symptoms vary by individual and circumstance, as well as the type of amnesia involved. There are several kinds, including retrograde and anterograde amnesia, among others. Retrograde amnesia is a loss of the past. Often, not all memories vanish completely, Generally, the most recent ones are lost, while older ones may remain, or in the case of a degenerative condition are the last to disappear. This phenomenon is known as Ribot's Law. It takes place because newer memories have weaker connections, while older memories have had more time to be recalled and grow stronger. Those with this condition may still make new memories despite their inability to recall the past before the brain injury took place. Semantics are often preserved, such as what color is which or what word means what, and skills or procedural abilities may remain as well. Events that took place or episodic memories, however, will be forgotten. Retrograde amnesia does not occur because of damage to the hippocampus, but to the prefrontal cortex or other locations where long-term memories are sometimes stored. Causes of retrograde amnesia include hitting the head, having a stroke, periods without oxygen, growths in the brain, brain infection, or alcohol abuse. In the case of Harrison Ford, engine failure in a subsequent plane crash left him with serious injuries requiring hospitalization. He could not explain what had happened before the crash due to the loss of memories surrounding the event. Because he could not remember what took place prior to getting hurt, but continues to know what happened after, this would be an instance of retrograde amnesia. Another well-known individual, Scott Bolzan, suffered from retrograde amnesia as well. In fact, his is one of the most severe cases ever known. After falling and hitting his head, 46 years of his memories were erased. However, though past memories will likely stay lost, he can make new ones today from now on. Anterograde amnesia is different from retrograde amnesia, as it's a loss of one's present. Those with this condition can no longer make memories of what is happening and therefore have no recollection of what just took place. This amnesia is due to problems with the making and then storing of memories and often involves the hippocampus. Memories that are lost because of anterograde amnesia are mostly based on fact, and many will retain procedures or skills. Further, the ability of those with anterograde amnesia to remember long-term memories often remains unchanged. Anterograde amnesia occurs for many reasons. It may be the result of a concussion or physical damage, as well as oxygen deprivation, epilepsy, or emotional trauma. It may also develop because of benzodiazepine drugs, alcohol, or injury to the hippocampus or medial temporal lobe. Oddly enough, it's been caused by a root canal as well. Such was the case of patient W.O. This man was unable to make new memories after the procedure and is stuck in March of 2005 on the day of his visit to the dentist. While this cannot be easily explained, some believe his neurons were negatively impacted in some way. Another man known as patient EP developed anterograde amnesia as well. His was the result of a viral infection that led to widespread inflammation and the destruction of his hippocampus. As a result, he could form no more memories. While retrograde or anterograde amnesia are devastating enough on their own, Clive Waring has both. In fact, Clive has what has been defined as the worst case of amnesia ever known. He was once a successful musicologist, pianist, and conductor until March of 1985. This was when he came down with an infection known as herpes encephalitis. The virus caused massive damage throughout his brain, and unfortunately, he has not been the same since. While Clive can understand what he sees and hears, their meaning is lost in an instant. His memory, which ranges from 7 to 30 seconds, is a moment in time, sometimes spanning the space of 2 blinks of an eye. When he speaks, he'll have forgotten the sentence that came before. If he answers a question, by the time he's done, he'll have forgotten what he was responding to. He has next to no recollections at all, though he has mentioned some childhood events as well as some things he remembers as a student in school. Both were long ago. Before the present moment, there are just decades of nothing, only darkness and a blank void. In fact, Clive believes that before now he was unconscious, in a coma, or for all intents and purposes, dead. To find some continuity in his life, he started a journal hoping it would help. But minute by minute, he would write, "I am awake," "I am conscious," or "this time properly awake," or "this time completely awake," while crossing out the entry from before. It did not take him long to create hundreds and hundreds of such pages. Clive cannot make inferences to fill in the blanks or recognize words in his own writing that he made moments ago. In moments of despair, he's told his wife Deborah that he is entirely incapable of thought. Over time, Clive's mood has improved, though his condition has not. While he may alternate between happiness and depression, during the worst of times his complaint is the same, that he hasn't heard anything, seen anything, touched anything, or smelled anything that he can remember. He says life is like a long night spanning years without an end, and without him being conscious of anything in it. but he has found joy at times through his music and through the love he still feels for his wife. His wife Deborah is the only person he can recognize, though he cannot recall her name. Each time he sees her, he gets overjoyed as he believes that it has been years. When she leaves, he's been known to call her more than once on her way home, asking her to visit, forgetting that she just has. Yet their love endures, strong as it ever was despite it all. The reasons for this are somewhat of a mystery, as emotional memory is not well understood. To Clive, it's a much-needed gift. In an existence like death, Deborah gives him life. It's Deborah who is his one and only joy apart from music, a passion they both always have and will continue to share. As a former pianist, when Clive is asked if he can play a song, he'll respond that he cannot and never has. However, when at the piano, he can play and do so well. Similarly, though he cannot tell you how to get to his home, he can unbuckle his seatbelt, indicating that he knows he's near. He knows his way around his home and he can even prepare a beverage to enjoy. But unless he's actually doing these things, he's unaware he can, and could not explain them if he was asked. Clive is a man who is lost in time with little to no knowledge of his past, and who forgets his present virtually as it takes place. Retrograde and anterograde amnesia have trapped him in only a sliver of consciousness. However, love endures and he holds tightly onto his wife and to his music as a source for comfort. Without these, he's lost without a past in an ever-changing and confusing present, and with more of the same to come. Unfortunately, Clive was not the first to suffer both the loss of his past and an inability to remember his present. Patient HM, famous among the medical community, has these difficulties too. He was 27 years old when he underwent surgery for seizures and the hippocampus from each temporal lobe was removed. Afterwards, he could make no new memories. He also lost his memories of the past, but this was thought to be due to his seizures and the use of anti-epileptic drugs. Like Clive, he forgot who he was talking to, or what about, almost right away. While he could both draw and practice drawing to improve, he wasn't aware that he had drawn before, much like Clive in his ability to play the piano, though he was unaware that he knew how. While Clive could remember some of his childhood, the same was true for patient HM. In this instance, he was stuck at the age of 16. Mentally, he remained that old until he died. The importance of memories is clear. If structures of the brain are damaged enough, it will impact our lives forever. We may in fact believe that we are no longer really living at all. Due to his amnesia, Clive exists in an often empty world, yet has periods of joy as well as distress. Ice. It's great for our drinks and can be fun to slide on. Historically though, it's proven to not be so great a thing to take naps under. Yet in 2016, one man was buried under ice for several hours, and despite what you might expect, he came back to life when resuscitated. Yet how did this lucky man manage to do the impossible? It was a blustery winter morning in Pennsylvania when Don Smith spotted his son's boot sticking out from under a snowdrift on the side of the road. Screeching his car to a halt, he rushed out into the snow and started digging his son out of the snowdrift under which he was almost completely buried. To Smith's horror, his son's face was blue and he could feel no pulse or heartbeat. In a panic, he called 911, and as emergency responders braved the icy roads, he silently prepared himself for the worst. His son had been lying under a snowdrift for 12 hours in -4° Fahrenheit weather. How could there be any chance he would survive? Smith was flown via a helicopter to a nearby hospital, where a team of doctors and nurses warmed up his body and attempted unsuccessfully to restart his heart with CPR. The paramedics were unable to find any signs of life in Justin Smith's body, and one even draped a sheet over what was presumed to be a corpse. Yet, as the coroner was called and the police began their investigation into the exact circumstances surrounding his death, emergency department physician Gerald Coleman ordered a potassium test of Smith's blood, as high levels of potassium in the blood indicates that heart muscle activity is either significantly reduced or has completely stopped. However, to the surprise of everyone, the test results came back normal, giving the hospital staff hope that the heart could in fact be restarted. Using a technique called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, the doctors began to pump warm oxygenated blood into Smith's heart and then throughout his body. Incredibly, the heart began to slowly quiver, and using shock paddles, the doctors managed to shock the heart into restarting completely. Smith was then hooked up to ventilators, which would breathe for him, and warm oxygenated blood continued to be pumped through his thawing body. Despite the miracle of restarting Smith's frozen heart, doctors feared that he would in effect be brain dead after an incredible 12 hours of lying frozen under a snowdrift. Against all odds, scans began to pick up electrical signals given off by neurological activity, and as the signals increased, it would become clear that Smith was experiencing completely normal brain activity. Though he would lose his toes and little fingers to frostbite, Smith would eventually wake up from his coma and make a complete recovery. As incredible as it may seem, freezing might have actually saved Smith's life. When the body is frozen at the right rate, the slowing metabolic processes will actually protect the body from the effects of exposure. Cooling cells slows down their metabolic activity, and they don't require as much oxygen to function anymore. And as the heart slows and breathing stops, the body enters a state of suspended animation. The key to Smith's survival was that his heart had kept very slowly beating for hours after his burial in ice, and doctors managed to begin CPR on him not too long after it stopped beating. The still oxygenated blood in his system helped keep his organs alive thanks to their vastly reduced metabolic activity, not at all dissimilar to the way that hibernating animals can dramatically reduce both their heartbeats and their breathing rate and still remain alive. Smith's miraculous recovery has encouraged modern medicine to consider that there's no temperature too low to try to resuscitate someone, and his story is mirrored throughout history, with a little girl in 1994 being brought back to life after freezing solid. One winter morning, 5-year-old Carly Kosolowski woke up to her father saying goodbye as he prepared to go to work. He tucked Carly in bed with her mother and promptly left. Unbeknownst to her father, though, Carly had gotten up and tried to follow her dad outside, leaving the house dressed in nothing more than her pajamas. Once outside, the door closed behind her and she realized she was too short to reach the outside door handle. For 5 hours, little Carly lay against the front door of her house in below-zero winter weather, discovered by her mother frozen stiff. Her mother, who had been trained in CPR, immediately began to try and resuscitate her but was unable to. Carly was rushed to the hospital where doctors would successfully warm up her body and bring her back to life. Incredibly, Carly also suffered no brain damage despite her prolonged ordeal, and the only major injury was the amputation of the lower part of her left leg due to frostbite. In 1980, 19-year-old Jean Hillard was driving home in her hometown of Langby, Minnesota on a night with minus 22-degree weather. Suddenly, her truck hit a patch of ice and the brakes locked, sending her into a ditch. Living in a rather rural area, Jean began to walk to try to find help, wearing only a jacket, jeans, and cowboy boots. One of her best friends lived only 2 miles down the road, and Jean was confident she could make the walk. As she walked along the icy road, though, she began to feel lethargic and confused, early signs of hypothermia. And then when she finally saw the lights of her friend's home, Jean collapsed and blacked out. The next morning, her friend woke up and discovered a large lump in the snow just 15 feet from his door, and investigating, he was horrified to discover that it was Jean. Rushed to the hospital, the medical staff was pessimistic about Jean's chances of survival. Her body was frozen so stiff that they were unable to pierce her flesh with the hypodermic needle. The needle simply snapped off on contact with her frozen solid body. Her body temperature was so low that it didn't register on a thermometer, and her face was ashen gray in color. Deciding that she was dead, the staff still tried to warm up her body with the heating pads, and when her body reached a temperature of 88 degrees, physicians were shocked to discover a faint pulse of 12 beats a minute. Then, the doctors heard a very faint whimper, and they knew Jean was alive. Incredibly, Jean would be up and talking normally just a few hours later, worried about what her dad might think of her wrecking his truck. Medical terminology has come a long way since 1980, and today, doctors have found that half of hypothermia patients who are treated with extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, the process of pumping warmed blood into the heart and body that saved Justin Smith's life, all make a recovery, even if they've been in cardiac arrest for an extended period of time. Shockingly, if the patients had actually become hypothermic before their oxygen levels dropped too low, doctors believe that they could have escaped the worst of the long-term damage that comes from having your heart stop for long periods of time. Doctors are swiftly adopting new techniques that involve chilling patients who have suffered from extreme trauma, and at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, surgeons have been experimenting with pumping a cold saline solution into the arteries of patients suffering from gunshot and knife wounds in order to bring down the body's temperature. The emergency procedure would at one time have been considered practically murder, yet today doctors understand that gradually cooling the body slows down the metabolic process and can buy time for saving the life of someone who suffered major blood loss. loss. The reduced need for oxygenated blood from chilled organs means that they can last longer without suffering damage that could prove to be fatal or lead to severely diminished function, especially in the brain. Yet, as revolutionary as these new procedures are, some doctors have long known the benefits of chilling a patient's body. Since the 1960s, surgeons in Siberia have been putting babies in snowbanks before major operations, and induced hypothermia has been useful for treating pediatric heart patients elsewhere for a long time. In most places, though, the procedure is a bit more refined than simply dumping a baby into a bunch of snow. But then again, as they are fond of saying in Russia, if it works, it works. The process of rapidly replacing a patient's blood with icy salt water, though, is relatively new and quite radical. Yet the technique seems to be working, and doctors refer to the procedure as suspending life, wary of the science fiction implications of calling it suspended animation. The body seems to be incredibly resilient, and as medical technology advances, we're learning ever more incredible things about it. Sadly though, thousands of people still freeze to death every year across America, and perhaps with more examples of these miraculous recoveries, doctors may learn more about what exactly happens to the body as it freezes, and how it may be brought back from what appears to be death. For the time being though, we're going to go ahead and recommend that you don't make it a habit to take naps under large piles of snow. And if you get in a car accident in the middle of a blizzard, the best thing to do is to stay inside the cab of your vehicle and keep yourself warm. Wait for someone to come driving by. Or if you're in a really remote area, at least wait for the weather to clear a bit. Back in the day, if you wanted to become a public enemy #1, you really had to work for the title, and the man we're going to talk about today definitely put in the effort to earn it. He started small and ended his career with a series of crimes that would go down in American history. In the 1930s, stories pervaded the US public landscape about this expert machine gunner and his crime sprees. The authorities were always one step behind as Machine Gun Kelly robbed banks across the country, from Texas to Mississippi to Washington to Iowa. But these robberies would pale in comparison to his last brazen misadventure. Let's now see how this all unfurled. He was born on July 18, 1895 in Memphis, Tennessee, and given the name George Kelly Barnes. What we know about his childhood is that unlike many other master criminals of the time, he wasn't born destitute, and his family were said to be fairly wealthy, and his upbringing traditional. Little else is known about his early life, but we know that he got into Mississippi State University and took a course in agriculture in 1917. He wasn't a good student, however, with his best grade being a C+, and that was only for good physical hygiene. He was a troublesome student and rarely on the good side of the university staff. Studying wasn't for him, and when he met a young woman named Geneva Ramsey, he decided enough was enough and quit his education. The two got married very quickly and had 2 sons. Now the prodigal son had to fend for himself and for his new family, which wasn't easy. First, he took a job as a cab driver in Memphis, but this wasn't paying the bills. He was just 19 and things weren't easy, so he looked for other avenues to make some quick cash. It seems his wife wasn't very happy about living hand to mouth, and she divorced him, leaving young Kelly broke and heartbroken. So, what do you do when you're stone broke, down on your luck, and you live in the Prohibition era? Well, one option is becoming a gangster, and that's exactly what George decided to do. He became a bootlegger, a purveyor of illegal alcohol. This didn't go unnoticed by the Memphis police, and soon George had made a name for himself. This was, of course, not good for a man whose family were notable wealthy folk, so he decided to change his name to George R. Kelly. He then headed out west to seek fortune, which would soon turn into infamy. On his journey, he managed to evade arrest and gain a reputation in the underworld, and it wasn't until 1928 when the law finally got the better of him. That year, the cops arrested Kelly for smuggling alcohol into an Indian reservation, and he was sentenced to 3 years at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. After doing his time, and we should say as a model prisoner, George got out and quickly met a woman who you could say helped create the legend. Her name was Catherine Thorne. Before that, she had gone by Cleo Mae Brooks, and eventually she'd become Mrs. Kelly. We should say something about this woman because she's an integral part of the Machine Gun Kelly story. She already had a colorful history of her own before she met George, including having already been married 3 times. Her last husband wound up shot dead with a suicide note left next to him. Nothing too out of the ordinary. The problem was, he was illiterate. It's widely believed Catherine had murdered him, but she was never convicted of the crime. One of the investigators was sure she'd done it, and she had even been overheard prior to his death saying that she wanted him dead. She was certainly working outside the law when she met George, and as you'll see, she just got worse. When she met Kelly, she was the mistress of another criminal, a small-time bootlegger named Steve Anderson. After her dalliance with Kelly, the two soon became inseparable, and in 1930, they were married in Minneapolis. Here's where the tale of a garden-variety crook turns into the stuff of legends. As the story goes, Catherine decided to go out and buy a gift for her new husband. That present turned out to be a Thompson submachine gun. She told her lover to go out into the open and practice with it and become an expert at using it. He dutifully did what he was told, and once he could use the gun, Kelly soon began his crime spree of robbing banks with his trusty weapon. Let's remember that before this, Kelly was what you might call an up-and-coming criminal, but with his wife's help, he soon gained a fierce reputation as a notorious machine gun-wielding robber. She wanted her husband to have this great reputation, and it's said in her bid to market him, she even went around local underground drinking clubs where gangsters frequented, handing out spent cartridges, telling people, "Here's a souvenir from the man known as Machine Gun Kelly." He robbed quite a few banks, but it wasn't until 1933 that his name became known across all of America, while the FBI made him public enemy number 1 and put out wanted posters for him that described him as an expert machine gunner. It was that same year that the husband and wife team along with an associate hatched the biggest crime yet. The plan was to kidnap a wealthy oil tycoon from Oklahoma City named Charles Frederick Urschel. Here's how it went down. It's July 22, 1933, and Urschel is playing bridge at his luxury residence with his friends. Their wives are there too. Kelly storms into the party, his machine gun in hand, and at his side, his accomplice Albert L. Bates, another seasoned criminal. This was no ordinary stick-up, and the men now looking down the barrel of America's most famous gun are told that they're leaving the game, otherwise someone's head is going to be blown off. They take Urschel and his friend Walter R. Jarrett from the house and force them into a car outside. At this point, the kidnappers don't even know which man is Urschel. They drove as fast as possible out past city limits where they were far away from people, and the two men were told to get out their wallets. While Jarrett was also in the oil business and quite wealthy himself, Kelly only wanted Urschel, so Jarrett was let go unharmed. But not before taking the $51 out of his wallet. They drove to a farmhouse in Paradise, Texas, where they kept Urschel hostage. The two men put out the word that if Urschel was to ever be seen again alive, a ransom had to be paid of $200,000. That was a lot of money at the time, the equivalent of around $4 million today. The FBI has since published the ransom letter. In part, it went like this: "You will pack $200,000 and use genuine Federal Reserve notes of $20 denomination in a suitable, light-colored leather bag." There's also a threat, of course, which reads, "Remember this, if any trickery is attempted, you will find the remains of Urschel, and instead of joy, there will be double grief. For someone very near and dear to the Urschel family is under constant surveillance and will likewise suffer for your error." Believe it or not, the Urschel family decided to pay the money, and 8 days after the patriarch was kidnapped, the cash was dropped off in $20 bills at La Salle Hotel in Kansas City. The next day, the gangsters made good on their word and let Urschel go at a place called Norman in Oklahoma. There, the wealthy businessman nonchalantly walked into a restaurant and called for a cab. He was pretty unfazed by the ordeal, and for good reason. You see, Urschel didn't make all of that money by being stupid, and during his kidnapping, he was staying vigilant and collecting information on his assailants. At no time could he see through his blindfold, but all the time he was listening to the sounds around him. He knew, for instance, when an airplane passed overhead each day, and this would prove valuable. He made sure to leave his fingerprints everywhere, and when possible, he cataloged how many steps it took him to get somewhere. He knew how long he traveled in a car and when it stopped for gas. All this was so he could give some description to the FBI as to where he might have been kept. It was a huge case too, and J. Edgar Hoover put his best men on it. With the help of Urschel and his formidable memory, the FBI soon had a list of possible places where Urschel might have been kept. They soon descended on the Paradise farmhouse and found that people were there, but not who they were expecting. The FBI discovered Robert and Ora Shannon and Harvey Bailey, who had been using the farmhouse as a safe house of their own after committing a robbery. They also had some cash from the kidnapping, around $700 according to the FBI. Of course, Kelly hadn't just waited around once he had the cash. He and his wife started hopping from state to state in an attempt to throw off law enforcement. The group at the farmhouse were arrested, and more arrests would follow because kidnapping, staying hidden, and getting rid of vast amounts of money takes a lot of people. Several arrests were made, including people charged with money changing. The hunt was now on for the masterminds of the kidnapping, and the Kellys weren't too happy about what was going on. As others were arrested, they sent letters to the Urschel family, as well as attorneys and judges warning that they were coming to get him. In August, Kelly's accomplice from the kidnapping, Bates, was arrested in Denver, Colorado, with $660 and a machine gun on him. At around this time, the FBI was discovering the stolen bills all over the USA and was making various arrests, but the Kellys were still nowhere to be seen. But you could only run for so long. In the early hours of September 26, 1933, after receiving a tip, a residence in Memphis was raided where the fugitive couple were finally found. The great Machine Gun Kelly was without his gun. And as the legend goes, he shouted to the agents, "Don't shoot, G-men! Don't shoot, G-men!" Apparently, he had a terrible hangover after a big night, and he was caught while still in his pajamas. Nightgown Kelly just doesn't have the same ring to it. The couple was taken to Oklahoma City, and on October 12, 1933, George and Catherine Kelly were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In all, 21 people were convicted for crimes related to the case. This included 6 life sentences and other sentences, making up in total 58 years, 2 months, and 3 days. Kelly was taken to Leavenworth Prison in Kansas, and his wife was taken to a federal prison in Cincinnati. In prison, Kelly often bragged that he'd escape, and the authorities didn't take this lightly. In 1934, he was transferred to a new prison, a place no one could break out of. Soon, Kelly would get a new nickname, inmate number 117, at his new home, Alcatraz. Behind bars, Kelly was actually said to be a model inmate, taking jobs and keeping his head down. He apparently felt remorse for his crimes and on several occasions wrote to the Urschels. That didn't help him though, and he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. In 1951, he was transferred back to Leavenworth and died 3 years later on his birthday from a heart attack. Catherine managed to finish her sentence and was released in 1958. After years behind bars, she didn't return to a life of crime and got a job as a bookkeeper at a nursing home and hospital in Oklahoma. The widow of Machine Gun Kelly died in 1985 at the age of 81. You've seen the movie Castaway, and obviously now you're a bit of an expert on how to survive on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean. You first do some recon to see if anyone else is on the island and if there's anything to eat, like bananas conveniently dangling from trees or any wandering animals. Nothing. It seems you'll have to fashion a spear so that you might do some shallow water fishing. Well, that turns out to be more difficult than you thought. At least you managed to collect some rainwater after a shower, using a large leaf as a receptacle. You're also well aware that if you don't find something head-shaped and proceed to draw eyes on it and a nose, you might lose your mind. You call him Rocky, or if it's a girl, you might call her Coco or Shelly. In reality, your chances of surviving on an uninhabited island for a long time are slim. If you got washed up without any tools, you might find yourself in a bit of a pickle. Even if you did find the most important thing, drinkable water, you're still going to have to build a shelter, make a tool for hunting, and actually be able to hunt. Indeed, if there is anything available to kill. But some people have survived, and now we will introduce you to one Captain Thomas Musgrave, a man whose story is nothing short of amazing. He was born in England in 1832, but at the young age of 16 he set out to sail the seas for the first time. He made a career out of this, but when his ship, the Grafton, left Australia on the 12th of November 1863 to go out and search for mining and sealing opportunities, his life would change forever. A crew of just 5 first headed off to Campbell Island, which is part of New Zealand's sub-Antarctic islands. Quite frankly, it's in the middle of nowhere, but on that island it was believed that there would be tin to mine, and so off the guys went. They had a backup plan too, because if tin wasn't found, they could at least do a bit of seal hunting and on their return, sell the furs and oil. Sometimes life throws a curveball at you, and after reaching that remote place, the guys couldn't find any tin to mine. And on top of that, it seems the seals hadn't turned up for the hunting party. They couldn't go back empty-handed since explorations were an expensive endeavor. They decided to head back to Auckland Island and explore there. It was a Thursday, on December 31st, 1863. Not a good day for a sailor. Strong winds battered the ship. The water broke in all directions and a thick fog surrounded the vessel. These bad conditions remained, but on New Year's Day, the men got sight of the island. As they approached, they saw a large number of seals, so that lifted the men's moods. But then the bad weather again started to batter the ship. They managed to drop both anchors, but in the strong winds, heavy rain, and rough seas, they couldn't steady the ship. At around midnight, a violent gale blew the ship against the rocks. The water rushed into the ship, and in no time, the ocean was spilling onto the deck. The men abandoned all hope of pumping the water out and instead gathered up as many provisions as they could. The ship was wrecked. It was a lost cause. They did get close enough to the island to get their things and leave the ship though. They were at least alive, but none of those 5 men could envision what awaited them. With them, they had some food. They had tools as well as a gun and gunpowder. For a shelter, they could use bits of the ship, including the sails. They got to work. A week passed and the men hadn't been able to get much done due to awful weather and vicious winds. But when things cleared up, they got to work on the shelter. With timber from the boat as well as cloth from the sails, it wasn't that hard to knock up a shelter. It helped that one of the crew members had experience in this and he at least had a combination hammer, something similar to an axe and a drill. In time, they had a stable cabin to live in. Soon it would have a chimney so they could have a fire in the place and that let the smoke out. It had a table, and to sleep on, the men made what looked like stretchers. Weeks passed and the provisions were running out, but those seals, they were virtually everywhere, and the men listened to them roar as they slept, which was like music to their ears. In fact, when they woke up, there'd be seals right outside their shelter, so the closest one got it and ended up seal meat. Living only on seal meat wasn't exactly the best diet, and the men didn't want to come down with scurvy, so they started looking for other food sources. Luckily, around the island there were widgeons, which are kinda like ducks. Those were very tasty. The guys also found that older seals tasted horrible, but if you could get a cub that had never even been in the water, it was delicious. On eating that for the first time, Musgrave remarked, "It tastes like lamb." The larger seals, it turned out, didn't much like those 2-legged animals taking their cubs, and on occasion they put up a fight. They were soon scared off when the men fired a gun. It wasn't always seal for dinner though. The guys also ate a lot of fish and crabs. As deserted islands go, this wasn't the worst of places at times. Nonetheless, as the months passed, the men started wondering how long it would take for an expedition to find them, if anyone was looking for them at all. The fact was, those guys had long been thought of as dead. Only 2 months had passed when Musgrave wrote this in his diary. "I am in exceedingly low spirits today, and I know that one loved one in Sydney is so also. For I have no doubt but by this time they have given me up for lost, and what is to become of my own dear wife and children? May God, to whom they can now look for comfort, watch over and protect them, is my constant and fervent prayer. I shall never forgive myself for coming on this enterprise." What could they do to pass the time? Well, they worked on that house of theirs, and with all the timber they needed, they made a pretty decent abode. It kept out the cold, had an area for working, a kitchen area, and a warm fire. On top of that, they'd managed to keep the mosquitoes out, and that had been an annoyance. Some seal clubbing days, things didn't always go to plan. In fact, on one particular day, a tiger seal had taken offense to the clubbing of one of his young friends, and one of the men had to hide up a tree until the others came to his rescue. What Musgrave would call pitched battles with seals would become quite a regular occurrence. After months passed, the major battle was misery. The days were long, and the weather was terrible, and the men lost all hope of ever leaving the island. They played games and they made up their own dominoes, but there was only so much they could do to keep their spirits up. Their spirits were lifted considerably when one of the men made a huge breakthrough. What was that, you might ask? The answer is the man had successfully made his own hooch, a kind of prison beer that didn't taste too bad. He made this from a flower that grew all over the island, which he then fermented. They now had beer on tap for as long as they wanted, and it also became another part of their mixed diet. After a few months and a lot of drinks, they also had taught the parrots they had to talk, which was some amusement for them. Still, on May 15th, Musgrave wrote, "Oh my God, how long is this to last? Oh, release me from this bondage. Night and morning, day and in my dreams, I offer up my prayers to thee." They had better fishing techniques, but then in June the seals disappeared and their main food source was gone. The water was warmer and the seals spent most of their time in the water. Hunting them became difficult. Now came the hunger. Months passed and the seals finally returned. The men had food, but no hope of ever seeing a ship sail close to the island. In October, Musgrave wrote, "It would be impossible for me to convey to anyone an idea of my present state of mind. I am anything but mad. If that would come, it would very likely afford relief." It was that month that the men realized that they had to get off the island. Food wasn't always available, and there were periods of terrible hunger. Their health was affected, but some had been injured while out hunting and surveying. Things weren't looking good. Building a ship to sail through rough waters isn't quite as easy as the movies depict, and without an expert or even a carpenter, Musgrave wrote that the idea of just making a ship that wouldn't sink in a second seemed farcical to him. Nonetheless, the men collected as many parts of the wreckage as they could and discussed how they'd build this thing. If anything, they had time in the day to think and build. Besides bouts of hunger, the men managed to start putting something together that looked seaworthy. Musgrave wrote, "I hope we may succeed. It's quite true that by energetic perseverance, men may perform wonders, and our success would by no means constitute a miracle. The men are all very sanguine, and I have no doubt but we shall be able to make something that will carry us to New Zealand." Sanguine means positive, if you didn't know that. Over a year had passed, and there had been failed attempts to launch their homemade boat. Some days were spent fixing that thing, and others were spent in hunger and looking for grubs to eat. Musgrave put his diary down for months, and then in spring he picked it back up again. The men are in what he calls a deplorable state, skinny and dressed in rags. They face grim starvation at times and almost want to gnaw on their own hands. In June, Musgrave wrote, "We were all seized with a violent attack of dysentery about the same time. This we have all recovered from, but I am left with rheumatic pains and cramps, which will in all probability cling to me through life." But it's time to launch the boat. Even though they accept there is little probability of success, they will not survive much longer on the island, but the thought of drowning also weighs heavily on their minds. One thing that did lift their spirits was the discovery of a cat, which stayed with them while they finished their vessel. On the 27th of June, they launched the boat, which was so frightening some of the men wanted to return to the island. After attempts to sail were made, it was clear that 5 men were just too heavy, and it was decided that 2 men would be left behind, and if the others made it home, they would send out a ship to collect them. The 3 finally managed to sail to Stewart Island, which was inhabited. There, they met a Captain Cross, the first human they'd seen in 18 months. This is what Musgrave wrote. "When we landed, I could not stand, but was led up to that gentleman's house, where something to eat was immediately prepared for us, of which I partook very sparingly, for I felt ill and unable to eat." Weeks passed, but the men and Captain Cross eventually made it back to the island, where they hoped the 2 men that were left behind were still alive. This is how Musgrave described the joyous meeting. "One of them, the cook, on seeing me, turned as pale as a ghost and staggered up to a post, against which he leaned for support, for he was evidently on the point of fainting, while the other, George, seized my hand in both of his and gave my arm a severe shaking, crying, 'Captain Musgrave, how are ye? How are ye?' What's more incredible is that 4 months after those men had been shipwrecked on that island, another ship had been destroyed and another group of sailors were trying to survive on another part of the island. Both groups had no idea the other was on the island. On that other ship, only 19 of the 25 men got to shore and the others drowned. They didn't have the same luck and there was less to eat, and in the end only 3 survived when they were seen by a passing ship. Some died of starvation, others were abandoned. In their case, it was every man for himself rather than the collaboration Musgrave enjoyed with his men. One of the 3 survivors said things were grim, and at one point 2 men got in a fight and one killed the other. The next morning, the winner of that fight was eating the loser. If you like tales of survival, we have some other amazing stories of a different type of survival for you. Try one of these amazing videos: Chernobyl Suicide Squad, 3 men who prevented even worse nuclear disaster, or the only man to survive 2 nuclear bombs.